Imagine the scene. The year is 1340, and within the hallowed, unyielding stone walls of a great abbey, a sacred silence reigns, broken only by the whisper of prayer and the scratch of a quill. We see the monk, a figure of profound austerity, his life a testament to denial, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience in the service of his God. His world is one of cold cells, simple food, and endless devotion, a spiritual fortress built against the temptations of the fallen world. But what if this fortress was merely a facade, a carefully constructed stage upon which a far more human drama unfolded? What if behind piety's veil lay a secret world of earthly pleasure, of roasted meats, forbidden wine, and sins of the flesh? To understand the spectacular nature of this failure, one must first appreciate the terrible genius of the machine designed to ensure its success, a document forged in the 6th century that would become the very blueprint for the spiritual life of the West for 1,000 years. This was the Rule of Saint Benedict, and it was not a gentle guide but an instrument of psychological vivisection, a detailed manual for the complete dismantling of the human ego. At its heart lay 3 vows, 3 blades honed to sever a man from the world, from his body, and from his very self. The first and most absolute was obedience, the death of the will. A monk was to become an automaton of faith, his every action dictated by the ringing of a bell, his every decision made by his abbot, who was to be seen as the very incarnation of Christ within the monastery walls. To obey without question, without delay, and without the slightest internal murmur of dissent was the first step toward holiness. To hesitate was to sin. The second vow was poverty, the death of identity. This was not the simple act of giving away one's possessions, but the total annihilation of the concept of ownership. The monk owned nothing, not the tools in his hands, not the simple wooden bowl from which he ate, not even the coarse woolen habit on his back. All was held in common, alone from God, and to harbor a secret desire for even a single coin was to commit a spiritual theft. He was to be a man without property, without status, without a past defined by material wealth, a naked soul before his Maker. But it was the third vow, chastity, that waged the most intimate and violent war. This was the death of the flesh, a command to live in a state of perpetual quarantine from the most fundamental of human drives. It was a vow of absolute celibacy, a relentless battle fought not only in the body but in the treacherous landscape of the mind, a demand to purge every memory of touch, every phantom of desire, every waking and sleeping thought that might lead to carnal impurity. It was a vow of profound and radical loneliness, a severing of the self from the warmth of human connection. Obedience, poverty, chastity. This was the 3-pronged assault on human nature, an impossibly perfect standard for an imperfect species. This was the divine ideal. What follows is the human reality. The grand edifice of monastic denial, built upon the bedrock of Benedict's rule, was a fortress of the spirit, yet its first and most significant crack appeared not in the soul, but in the stomach. The war against the flesh began with the taming of the tongue, for it was believed that the consumption of rich foods, particularly the hot, blood-filled meat of 4-legged beasts, inflamed the passions and opened a direct pathway to the sin of lust. The rule was therefore explicit and unyielding. The flesh of the quadruped was forbidden to all but the gravely ill, a line drawn between the passions of the world and the serenity of God's service. The monastic diet was to be one of bland submission, a daily sacrament of bread, vegetables, and perhaps fish, each meal a reminder that the body was not a vessel for pleasure but a beast to be starved into obedience. But in the legalistic piety of the medieval mind, every ironclad rule contained the seed of its own circumvention, a single thread of exception that, when pulled by determined hands, could unravel the entire tapestry of asceticism. The exception was for the sick. And so, with the casuistry of hungry lawyers, the monks engineered a space of magnificent hypocrisy, a room that existed in a state of perpetual legal fiction. They built the misericorde, the room of mercy, physically attached to the infirmary to maintain its flimsy pretext. This chamber became the monastery's secret stomach, a place where the rule of the refectory did not apply. Here, the silence of the main hall was replaced by the tearing of flesh and the gnawing of bone. Here, in carefully scheduled rotations, healthy monks would declare themselves momentarily unwell to partake in a ritual of sanctioned gluttony, gorging themselves on roasted pork, venison, and beef, their faces slick with forbidden grease. For centuries, this was their secret. But history has a long memory, and the earth itself has become the chief witness for the prosecution. Modern archaeology, digging into the trash pits and latrines of these great abbeys, has unearthed the damning evidence. Vast, layered deposits not of fish bones and oyster shells, but the skeletal remains of countless pigs, sheep, and cattle. A silent testament to centuries of feasting. This was the first great betrayal. A systemic, institutionally approved surrender to the most basic of appetites, proving that once the fortress wall was breached, the appetites of men would flood in. While the common monk navigated the treacherous currents of his appetite through carefully constructed loopholes, the master of the house, the abbot himself, often dispensed with such niceties altogether, for he was a creature of two worlds. A spiritual father, who was also, in every practical sense, a feudal prince. As the monastery's wealth swelled, accumulating vast tracts of land, forests, and mills, its elected leader was transformed from a humble shepherd of souls into a powerful magnate, a major player in the intricate game of medieval politics. This duality was nowhere more apparent than in his lodgings, which were frequently not a simple cell within the dormitory but a separate, palatial residence built against the abbey walls, a place where the vow of poverty went to die. Here, while his spiritual sons shivered on straw pallets in a communal hall, the abbot slept in a soft feather bed, his chambers warmed by a private fireplace, the stone walls insulated with expensive tapestries depicting hunts and battles, rather than saints and martyrs. He had his own kitchen, his own staff of servants, and most importantly, his own dining hall, where the rule of Saint Benedict was not merely bent, but utterly shattered. The abbot's table was a spectacle of worldly power, a groaning testament to the fact that while the monastery was notionally in the world but not of it, its leader was very much both. Nightly, he entertained visiting nobles, bishops, and wealthy merchants, the conversation turning not on scripture, but on land disputes, grain prices, and political alliances. Before them would be laid a feast that rivaled any secular lord's. Courses of roasted swan and peacock, pies filled with spiced game, fish swimming in exotic sauces, and wines imported at great expense from the sunnier lands of the continent, all served on silver plates. The junior monk, sitting in the cold refectory, chewing his tasteless bread and listening to a Latin reading, could perhaps smell the tantalizing aromas drifting from the abbot's lodgings, a fragrant reminder of the vast chasm that separated the enforcers of the rule from its subjects. This was the ultimate hypocrisy, a poison that emanated from the very head of the institution, a silent sermon that taught the most dangerous of lessons, that piety was for the powerless and for the powerful. God's laws were merely suggestions. If the sin of gluttony was a crack in the monastery's foundation, then the river of alcohol that flowed through its heart was the flood that would rot the stones to their core. In an age where water was a vector for disease, ale was not a luxury but a lifeline, a form of liquid bread that was both safer to drink and rich in calories, making the monastic brewery a vital, respected, and highly profitable part of the abbey's economy. These were not humble operations but sprawling, industrial-scale facilities, their great copper vats bubbling ceaselessly, filling the air with the sweet, heavy scent of boiling malt and hops. Each monk was allotted a staggering daily portion, often a gallon or more of strong, nourishing ale, a tide of drink meant to sustain a life of hard labor and prayer. But sustenance is a near neighbor to intoxication, and this constant, flowing river of beer inevitably eroded the banks of pious discipline. The generous allowance became a torrent of temptation, and for many, the line between a necessary drink and a debilitating vice was washed away entirely. What began as a tool for survival became a catalyst for damnation. The official visitation records, those grim account books of monastic failure, paint a lurid and desperate picture of the consequences. Here, in the precise, dispassionate script of bishops' clerks, is the evidence of God's houses transformed into dens of drunken chaos. We read of monks found sprawled insensible in the cloister gardens, of sacred vespers disrupted by slurred and profane singing from the back pews, and of violent, brawling brothers settling theological disputes with fists and broken furniture. The solemn, orderly procession to prayer would become a stumbling, chaotic shamble. The sacred silence of the cloister would be shattered by boisterous laughter and furious, drunken arguments that echoed through the hallowed halls like the profane shrieks of demons. This was more than mere misbehavior. It was the total dissolution of the monastic ideal. The rigid timetable of prayer that gave monastic life its sacred rhythm fell into disarray. Undone by men, too intoxicated to wake or too hungover to stand, the devil's brew, as it was sometimes called, did more than just befuddle the senses. It dissolved the will, leaving the monk's soul undefended against the far darker temptations that awaited in the night. It was the great solvent of vows, the key that unlocked the door to gluttony, to wrath, and as we shall see, to the unquenchable fires of the flesh. With the will dissolved by drink and the body emboldened by rich food, the final and most fiercely defended fortress of the monastic ideal was left exposed to its most relentless enemy, the unquenchable fire of human lust. The vow of chastity was the centerpiece of the monk's war against the self, a commitment to live as a disembodied spirit, to sever all ties to the primal, procreative urge that bound humanity to the earth. It was a beautiful, impossible dream, and its failure was as inevitable as it was spectacular. The pressure of this denial, a constant and violent suppression of nature itself within the charged, all-male confines of the cloister, created a spiritual sickness that would erupt in a torrent of carnal sin. Once again, the unvarnished, brutal truth is not the stuff of rumor or anti-clerical propaganda, but is written in the cold, official script of the Church's own investigators. The episcopal visitation records read like ledgers of the damned, page after grim page detailing the myriad ways the vow of the flesh was grotesquely betrayed. We see the specter of the night-crawling monk, his sacred vows cast aside with his habit, slipping out under the cover of darkness to the nearby towns, seeking out the warmth and profane clamor of the tavern and the brothel, trading his soul for a moment of fleeting, anonymous release. The records of the great St. Albans Abbey and others speak of this as a rampant and persistent disease. Beyond these desperate, furtive encounters, there was the more calculated sin of the kept woman, the secret concubine established in a quiet village cottage, a phantom family that was a twisted mockery of the life the monk had publicly renounced. And then there was the most damning evidence of all, the living, breathing proof that could not be easily hidden or explained away. The children. The monastic account books, in their own cryptic way, tell the final chapter of this sordid tale. With entries for annuities and alms paid with suspicious regularity to certain women in the district, a clear record of hush money paid by the institution itself. This was the monastery's darkest secret, not just the sins of its monks, but its own complicity in the cover-up, paying to maintain the silence and provide for the flesh and blood consequences of their brother's forbidden touch. A quiet admission that the war against the flesh had been comprehensively and catastrophically lost. If the monk's flight to the brothel was a desperate escape from the monastery's suffocating piety, a far more insidious and unsettling drama was unfolding within the sacred walls themselves, in the shared intimacy of the dormitory and the shadowed corners of the cloister. This was the monastery's deepest and most guarded secret. A transgression so reviled, it was known simply as the peccatum mutum, the mute sin, or the unspeakable crime against nature. In a world violently segregated by gender, where men lived, worked, and slept in crushing proximity, their emotional and physical lives confined entirely to the company of their own sex, the intense bonds of spiritual brotherhood could sometimes curdle into a carnal intimacy that terrified the medieval mind. The evidence for these relationships is not found in account books paying off mistresses, but in the coded language of confessional manuals and the sheer venom of the condemnations. It was a sin that lived in the shadows, a world of charged glances, of favoritism, and of encounters in the dead of night, far from the abbot's watchful eye. But the true horror of this unspeakable sin lay not just in its commission, but in its potent utility as a weapon. Because sodomy was considered so utterly vile, and because its nature was so intensely private, the mere accusation was often enough to destroy a man completely. It was the perfect political tool. A faction of resentful monks seeking to unseat a strict abbot, or a rival prior coveting a higher office, needed no proof to set their plot in motion. They needed only to plant the poison of a whisper. Imagine the scene of a bishop's visitation, the formal inquiry into the spiritual health of the house, where a series of junior monks are brought forward to testify against their superior, their heads bowed as they speak of improper affections and special friendships that allegedly took place in the abbot's private chamber. Was it true? Was it a fabrication born of malice and ambition? In a sense, it did not matter. The charge, once uttered, would hang in the air forever, a permanent stain upon the abbot's reputation. The dormitory, a space intended for communal rest and spiritual vulnerability, was thus transformed into a theater of immense danger, where genuine affection could be misconstrued as sin, and where the most terrible of lies could be wielded like a dagger in the dark, ensuring that the secrets of the night remained buried in fear, shame, and silence. While the battles against lust and gluttony were waged in the treacherous territory of the flesh, the war against the third great vow, poverty, was a quieter but no less profound betrayal, a systematic dismantling of the very idea that a man of God should walk the earth unburdened by material things. The vow of poverty was meant to be the great equalizer, the sacred act of dispossession that rendered a nobleman's son and a peasant's boy identical in their shared state of having nothing, creating a truly classless society before the eyes of God. But this noble dream was undone by the simple fact that many monks were not peasants at all, but the younger sons of the aristocracy, men who had been swaddled in silk and raised on fine wine, who entered the monastery not necessarily out of a pure spiritual calling, but as a respectable career move. They took the vow with their lips, but in their hearts and bones they carried the ingrained expectation of comfort. The ideal of communal ownership, where a monk did not even own the habit on his back, decayed into a convenient fiction. Outwardly, he wore the simple, coarse robe of his order. But the visitation records tell a different story, a tale of hidden luxuries and defiant comforts. They speak of habits secretly lined with the soft, warm fur of squirrels and foxes, a forbidden barrier against the chilling damp of the stone walls. They describe the discovery of personal money purses filled with a secret stash of coins, a tangible link to the world of commerce and personal agency they had sworn to renounce. At the foot of many a monk's bed was a small wooden chest, which, when forced open by a bishop's official, was found to contain not just a prayer book and a rosary, but a trove of illicit items: a silver-handled knife, a private seal for signing letters, a sentimental locket from a life before the cloister. The very space they inhabited became a canvas for this small, persistent rebellion against austerity. A mattress stuffed with a little extra goose, down for softness, a smuggled-in candle to allow for private reading after the dormitory lights were extinguished. Each tiny act of personalization, each secret possession, was a declaration of the self in a world designed to annihilate it. This was not the grand, dramatic sin of the brothel or the drunken brawl, but a quiet, creeping corruption that exposed the ideal of poverty as an illusion, proving that even for men who had renounced the world, the desire to have and to hold something of one's very own was an instinct too powerful to ever truly be extinguished. The slow decay of personal piety found its most enduring monument not in the gleam of a golden chalice or the softness of a fur-lined habit, but in the very stones and mortar of the monastery itself, which was remade from a bastion of austerity into a palace of prayer. The transformation was insidious, a generation-long creep of comfort that began as practical improvement and ended as opulent indulgence. The old ideal of a monk shivering in a stone-walled dormitory his breath misting in the frigid air as a testament to his spiritual fortitude, was systematically dismantled. First came the great calefactory, or warming room, a concept born of necessity that quickly metastasized into luxury. What was once a single, grudgingly fed hearth in a communal chamber evolved into a vast, tile-floored hall with multiple fireplaces, their mantels ornately carved by the finest masons. Here, monks who had forsworn all worldly comforts would lounge on cushioned benches, their faces flushed from the heat, engaging in idle talk rather than contemplation, the roaring flames a physical manifestation of their forgotten vows of hardship. Even more telling was the evolution of the reread order, the monastic latrine. While the greatest kings and nobles of the age still made do with drafty garderobes discharging into stinking moats, the order pioneered systems of astonishing sophistication. They diverted entire streams to create constantly flushing channels beneath long rows of private, wainscoted stalls, ensuring a level of sanitation and privacy that was the envy of the secular world. This was not humility. It was a proud declaration of their wealth and ingenuity, a testament to a corporate body that prioritized the comfort of its members' bowels over the state of their souls. This architectural hedonism spread throughout the cloister. Dormitories were partitioned into private cells, each boasting a glazed window, and, in some cases, a small personal fireplace. The infirmary became less a place for the sick and more a retreat for the weary, with better food and warmer beds than the main abbey. The cloisters themselves, once simple, covered walkways for meditative pacing, were now adorned with grotesques and fanciful beasts carved into the capitals, their masons drawing more from profane bestiaries than from the Holy Scripture. The very layout of the monastery, designed by its founders to facilitate a life of disciplined prayer and labor, was now a blueprint for ease. The stones did not lie. They screamed a sermon of institutional pride and a deep-seated belief that they, the chosen of God, deserved a heaven on earth. The fortress built to protect the soul from the world had become a gilded cage, its walls meticulously engineered not to keep temptation out, but to lock every conceivable comfort in. The rigid dictum of ora et labora, prayer and work, had long since cracked under the immense pressure of a force more corrosive than any heresy: profound, soul-crushing boredom. Within the opulent walls of the monastery, the days stretched into an endless, gilded expanse. Each hour, a perfect, polished bead on a rosary of tedium. Work had become a symbolic gesture, performed by lay brothers and servants, leaving the monks with an abundance of time and a poverty of purpose. It was in the shadowy corners of the new, heated warming rooms and the secluded privacy of the partitioned dormitories that the devil's playthings found their most fertile ground. It began with chess, the noble game of strategy, its pieces intricately carved from ivory and ebony, a gift from a visiting bishop. At first, it was a silent, intellectual pursuit, a permissible sharpening of the mind. But soon the quiet contemplation of the board was replaced by the clatter of dice, their spots like little black sins tumbling across polished oak tables. The games were a desperate flight from the echoing silence of their own empty spirits. Inevitably, the stakes rose beyond mere pride. Monks who had taken a vow of poverty began to gamble, first with their wine rations, then with the small illicit treasures they had accumulated: a silver inlaid bookmark, a finely illuminated psalter inherited from a wealthy father, even the promise of favors and influence within the abbey's intricate politics. These secret wagers bred a bitter harvest of resentment and suspicion. Accusations of cheating, once unthinkable in a brotherhood sworn to honesty, were now whispered in the cloisters, and the quiet fellowship of the refectory was poisoned by silent feuds. Yet, for some, the thrill of a game of chance was not enough to fill the spiritual void. The abbot and his favored priors, men of noble birth who found the monastic life a poor substitute for the courts they had left behind, turned to a more visceral and worldly pursuit. Deep in the monastery's sprawling forests, far from any prying eyes, they maintained secret kennels and mews. On crisp autumn mornings, they would ride out, their fine wool habits hitched up for the saddle, unleashing hounds in pursuit of deer, and falcons in pursuit of heron. The bloody, aristocratic thrill of the chase, the thunder of hooves, the cry of the hawk. These were the sounds that truly stirred their hearts, a violent and worldly passion that drowned out the memory of their sacred vows. They had become lords of a wealthy fiefdom who happened to wear cowls, their prayers a hollow formality, before and after the real sacrament of the hunt, a brutal pastime that served as the final, damning evidence of their utter spiritual bankruptcy. The reckoning arrived not with the trumpets of apocalypse, but in the unassuming person of Bishop Anselm, a man whose gaunt frame and piercing eyes spoke of a piety that had long since withered in the abbey's comfortable halls. His visitation was an old and dreaded rite. But the monks, swaddled in the arrogance of their wealth, believed their practiced humility would suffice as it always had. They scrubbed the wine stains from the refectory tables and hid their ivory chess sets, presenting a facade of solemn devotion. But Anselm was not a man easily fooled by polished surfaces. He saw sin in the plumpness of a prior's cheeks, in the fine cut of an abbot's wool, and in the profound, spiritual emptiness that no amount of chanted psalms could fill. The unraveling was swift and merciless. An ill-timed boast from a drunken lay brother, a ledger of gambling debts discovered beneath a loose floorboard in the scriptorium, the damning discovery of the hidden mews and kennels. Each revelation was a nail hammered into the coffin of their corrupted order. The bishop's wrath, when it was finally unleashed in the chapter house, was a terrifying spectacle. He spoke not of mere broken rules but of a sacred trust profaned, of a house of God turned into a den of mammon, and a playground for the idle aristocracy. His voice, though never rising to a shout, cut through the assembly like a blade, stripping away their pretense and leaving their shriveled souls bare. The judgment that followed was absolute. The abbot was deposed on the spot, stripped of his ring and crozier, and sentenced to end his days in a remote, windswept monastery on a rock-bound coast, a place of genuine austerity. The priors who led the hunts and gambling were publicly flogged before their brethren, their backs bleeding onto the cold stone floors where they had once lounged in comfort. Penances were severe. Months of silence, diets of bread and water, and the endless, mind-numbing task of copying the entirety of the penitential psalms by hand. Every vestige of their indulgence was systematically purged, the fine tapestries were torn down, the secret wine cellars sealed, and the hunting hounds and falcons, those living symbols of their worldliness, were put down in a grim, silent ceremony. Yet, even in this righteous fury, the institution's instinct for self-preservation prevailed. The official report sent to Rome spoke only of administrative failings and the abbot's voluntary retirement due to ill health, a carefully constructed fiction to shield the wider church from the scandal of a house so utterly damned by its own comfort. With the passage of time, the scourged backs healed. The deposed abbot faded into an anonymous grave, and the monastery, under a new and sterner rule, resumed the outward rhythms of piety. The gold was stripped from the altars, and the hounds' kennels were turned to ruin, leaving behind an edifice of enforced austerity. It would be easy, looking back, to dismiss the fallen brotherhood as a simple cabal of hypocrites, a cautionary tale of worldly corruption staining a sacred calling. But to do so would be to miss the more profound and unsettling truth laid bare by their spectacular failure. Their story is not merely one of sin, but of a deeply and tragically human institution. The high walls and vaulted ceilings were built to contain and elevate the spirit, but they could never wall out the fundamental nature of the men who lived within them. The monastery, in its descent, became a perfect microcosm of the eternal human struggle, the glorious, aspirational reach for the divine, forever tethered to the inescapable gravity of carnal desire. These were not monsters, but men who sought an ideal so lofty that any stumble became a fall, and whose immense privilege insulated them from the very hardships that might have kept their vows sharp and their souls hungry for God. The prayer and work that was meant to fill their days was replaced by a vacuum of idle luxury, and into that void crept everything they had sworn to renounce: pride, envy, gluttony, and greed. Their legacy, therefore, is not a simple indictment of a corrupt past but a mirror held up to the present. The conflict that played out within those cloistered walls is the same one that rages within every human heart that has ever aimed for virtue and settled for comfort. The forgotten vows and secret indulgences are echoed in every abandoned resolution and every compromise made in the quiet dark. The stones of the abbey do not tell a story of saints and sinners, but of the vast, complex, and often failing territory in between, reminding us that the greatest challenge of faith is not fending off a distant devil, but mastering the all-too-human monastery within ourselves.